In a world where the sounds of music often drown out the screams of reality, there came a night when a deadly echo silenced a voice that sang for peace. It was December 8th, 1980, a date that millions would never forget. The setting was the vibrant city of New York, but the atmosphere was far from festive. Across the crowd that always gathered around the Dakota Building, there was a man whose mind was lost in an abyss of despair and delusions. His name was Mark David Chapman. Once he danced to the rhythm of the Beatles' musical revolution, idolizing the iconic John Lennon. But like the seasons that change and take with them the colors of nature, Chapman's love for Lennon was corroded by a dark resentment. Lennon's bohemian lifestyle, his defiant words against the established, and the provocative lyrics of his songs, all of this became a torment for Chapman. When the handcuffs tightened around his wrists on that fateful night, Chapman did not try to dodge the consequences of his horrendous act. He merely murmured that what he did was the will of God. Fans around the world found it impossible to digest the brutal reality that the man who once encouraged them to give peace a chance was taken away by a storm of bullets. Lennon's legacy was immortal, but reflection on what more he could have achieved had he lived added a bitter note to the eternal mourning. As we delve into the shadows that engulfed Lennon's bright light, we invite you to explore this somber narrative further in this video on our channel Brain Outside the Box. This is just the beginning of a journey that goes beyond musical notes and enters the shadowy corridors of the human mind. In the intricate tapestry of life, the threads of childhood are the ones that shape the final design most. For Mark David Chapman, these threads were tangled in fear and abandonment. Born into a home that should have been his haven, Mark only found storms. His father, a sergeant in the US Air Force, was a storm of fury, while his mother, Diane, was the calm waves before the storm. In the small town of Decatur, Georgia, Mark was introduced early to the duality of human nature. He took refuge in a fantasy world where he commanded a realm of little people who lived in the walls of his bedroom. This was his escape from the haunting reality, a reality of fear and violence. Adolescence brought with it new challenges. As drugs became his constant companion, education lost its luster in Mark's eyes. He found companionship among the rebels and the religious, a strange mix that reflected the battle occurring within his being. But even among friends, the sense of belonging evaded him. Once, the pain of alienation drove him to flee to Atlanta, where he roamed the streets, lost but desperately seeking something to give meaning to his existence. For Mark, this period was marked by an obsession that grew like a dark shadow in his soul. It was the era of the Beatles, and like many young people, he found himself swept up in the magic of their melodies. But unlike others, his admiration for John Lennon turned into an abyss of disdain. The year 1971 brought with it a new light to Mark's life, a light that promised to dissipate the shadows of his obsession. He embraced Christianity with fervent devotion. However, Lennon's words, which once compared the Beatles' popularity to that of Jesus, now sounded like blasphemy to his ears. Lennon's image began to distort in his mind, from a musical idol to a false prophet. Mark's journey through life continued to be a winding road. Among relationships, jobs, and a ceaseless search for a purpose, he seemed to always be on the brink of an abyss of despair. His encounter with Jessica Blankenship, his first love, seemed to promise a fresh start. But fate had other plans. The arrival at Covenant College seemed to be a chance to anchor his life in calmer waters. But fate, with its ironic manner, had yet another twist stored for him. In an environment of learning and quest for knowledge, Mark found himself torn between passion and morality. A slip, a moment of weakness with another student, and his world began to crumble like a house of cards in the wind. Guilt was a dark cloud in his mind, the battlefield where the storm raged. The consequences of his actions followed him like a shadow, swallowing the remaining shards of sanity and hope. Jessica, his love, abandoned him, and with her went the last glimpse of stability in his life. Mark fell into an abyss of despair, the world around him becoming a blur of disappointments and failures. The environment that once promised growth now was a constant reminder of his moral failure. He left the college, returning to the resettlement camp of Fort Chaffee. But the place that once offered him purpose now became a trigger for his suppressed anger. An altercation with his supervisor was the last straw, marking the end of yet another chapter in his tumultuous life. Mark's mind was becoming a dark labyrinth, and every decision took him deeper into the heart of the darkness forming within him. And so, as the shadow of death began to stretch over his soul, the world around him remained oblivious to the approaching hurricane. At the peak of his 22 years, Mark found his way to the exotic Hawaii, perhaps seeking refuge from the internal storms that tormented him. Instead, isolation amplified the echoes of his tumultuous mind. Depression deepened, and a failed attempt to take his own life led him to be hospitalized. After being diagnosed with depression, Mark started a new chapter in his life, working at the very institution that once welcomed him in his darkest moment. First in maintenance, then in the print shop, he seemed to be on a more stable path. Fate, always full of surprises, placed Gloria Abe in his life. A travel agent native to Oahu, she represented a chance for redemption and love. They married, and for a moment life seemed to offer a promise of normalcy. But old demons are never far away, and the strains of everyday life soon found their way back into Mark's life. Layoffs and misunderstandings at work became a constant, with each day becoming a struggle to maintain sanity and stability. Hawaii, with its tranquil beauty, contrasted with the storm that kept roaring within Mark, a storm that would eventually lead him back onto a dark path. At a certain point, a friend suggested Mark read the novel The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. With the turn of the pages, Mark found a strange resemblance between himself and the disillusioned 16-year-old protagonist, Holden Caulfield. Caulfield's revolt against the phoniness of the adult world resonated within him. He began to see certain celebrities, including John Lennon, as phonies who didn't deserve to live. The revolt that once was directed at himself was now being projected outwardly. The year 1980 arrived, and with it Mark's mind was entering dangerous territory. His thoughts became darker, and the idea of assassinating John Lennon began to take deep root. Alcohol became his constant companion, and his relationship with Gloria became violent. And with each passing day, the idea of killing Lennon seemed to gain more ground in his already disturbed mind. With the release of John Lennon's LP Double Fantasy in November 1980, the old sparks of obsession within Mark were reignited. Lennon, who had stepped away from the public eye, was back in the spotlight, and this did not go unnoticed by Mark. In early December, Mark found himself traveling to New York, under the pretense of wanting to clear his head and become a better adult. He assured his wife that he had abandoned his violent plans, claiming to have thrown the gun into the ocean. But Mark's desire to assassinate Lennon still burned intensely within him, a dark fire fueled by delusions and resentment. December 6, 1980, a date that would become a dark milestone. Mark acquired a copy of Lennon's Double Fantasy at a New York record store and positioned himself outside the Dakota waiting. 2 days later, his encounter with Lennon was not a coincidence, but a meticulously orchestrated plan. When Lennon stepped out of the building, an amateur photographer's camera captured the moment he autographed the album cover for Mark, a gesture of generosity that would be tragically repaid with violence. That night, around 10:30, Lennon returned from the studio, and Mark was there waiting. The world seemed to pause for a moment as Mark raised his gun and fired, hitting Lennon 4 times. Officers found Mark leafing through a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, the calm on his face contrasting with the carnage he had unleashed. At that hour, the world lost an icon, and Gloria, upon hearing the news, knew immediately of the monstrous act her husband had committed. The silence that followed the shots echoed through time, leaving a wound that would never really heal. Judgment Day arrived June 22, 1981, a day that would be marked by the quest for justice for a soul taken prematurely. Against the advice of his lawyer, Mark pleaded guilty to the murder of John Lennon. The courtroom, usually a place of heated debate, fell silent as Mark asserted that his decision was the will of God. His defense attorney argued fervently that a sound man could not commit such a heinous act, claiming that Mark was delirious and psychotic at the time of the crime. However, the prosecution was not convinced and described Mark's act as a premeditated and calculated execution. The exchange between the defense and the prosecution revealed the complexity of Mark's mental state. But in the end, the questions revolving around his sanity were eclipsed by the reality of the brutal act he had committed. The court's questions to Mark about the details of the crime were a somber dive into Lennon'S final moments. Mark's answer about the use of hollow-point bullets to ensure Lennon'S death resonated through the room, a chilling reminder of the coldness with which the act was committed. Verdict day arrived August 24, 1981. The courtroom was in anxious silence as the judge delivered the sentence. 20 years to life, with ongoing psychiatric treatment ordered for Mark. It was a small justice for the immeasurable loss the world had suffered. Before the sentence was delivered, Mark was given a chance to speak. He stood up and read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye, a choice that summed up his disconnection from reality and the gravity of his actions. The passage he chose spoke about protecting children from falling off a cliff, an ironic wish to save others while he himself was falling into an abyss of delusion and violence. The courtroom listened attentively, each word resonating with the sad irony of the situation. And as Mark was taken back to his cell, the world continued to mourn the loss of a voice that preached peace and love, a voice that was silenced too soon. Mark was sent to the Attica Correctional Facility outside Buffalo, far from the noise and hustle of the city, yet still immersed in a tumultuous world. In a confinement unit for at-risk prisoners, partly due to concerns that he might be killed by Lennon fans in the general population, the days dragged on, each bringing with it a reminder of his unthinkable act. In February 1982, an act of rebellion, Mark refused to eat for 26 days. The curtain of justice had to intervene, authorizing the state to force-feed him. And surprisingly, through all the challenges and trials, Gloria stood by his side. Conjugal visits became a glimpse of normalcy in a life now defined by steel and concrete barriers. Mark's narrative unfolds as a grim reminder of how obsession and disillusionment can lead to a path of destruction. After 6 years of silence behind bars, Mark finally decided to break the silence. He shared his story with journalist Jack Jones through recorded interviews. The tapes served as the basis for the book, Let Me Take You Down, Inside the Mind of Mark David Chapman. In December of 1992, he appeared on television, first on ABC's 2020 with Barbara Walters, and later on Larry King Live. The interviews gave the world a glimpse of the man behind the heinous crime. His face and story were brought to the big screen in 2 films that explored the tragedy from different angles. Public interest in his story never waned, a testament to the still open wound left by the loss of Lennon. And now, as we explore the dark corners of the human mind, we invite you to delve deeper into the stories that shaped our world on our channel, Brain Outside the Box. Each story a journey, each moment a chance to understand the complex fabric of human experience. We thank you for joining us on this intriguing narrative and invite you to join us on our YouTube video for a more in-depth exploration of this and other fascinating topics. Thanks for watching. Bye.